Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. We're about to start our afternoon seminar in our 13th summer school. We're really glad to have here Professor Bruno Cautrès from CESPO, our instructor here in summer school, and Guilherme Russo, head of research at Quaest Consulting and Research. The panel is the panel title is Electoral Polls, Methods, Possibilities, and Limitations. We're sorry for being late, and so we're gonna just about to start. Guilherme, you have around from 30 to 40 minutes, then Professor Bruno speeches, and then we open to the floor for questions and observations and so on, okay? So thank you for both accept our invitation and for being here. It's a pleasure for us to hear you both, okay? I can, yes, the time, everything, let me know. Okay. No. Just, the mic is yours.
Great. There you go. Hello. How are you guys? I'm really happy to be, can you hear me? Yes? Great. All right, cool. So I'm really glad to be here. This is, I think, my 4th time coming to the summer school. I was a TA, I was a student once, so it's really nice to be on this side. And to tell you guys that just really thankful for Glauco for the invitation and really happy to be next to Bruno here to talk about electoral polls. And I think electoral polls is tough. Let me tell you something. It's really hard because every end of an election cycle, this is the kind of headline they're going to get, right? Like everything was wrong. Electoral polling is very difficult. So this is from the US, a couple of headlines. In Brazil, even political scientists criticizing all electoral polling. So it's tough. This is what I'm going to start with, giving you the hard truth. But it's really fun. So at the same time, it's hard. Like I love it. I'm very passionate about it. And as the title of the presentation suggests, I'm going to talk a little bit about methods, about a bunch of possibilities, especially because of limitations, right? So I'm really focused on bringing sort of the state of the art, what is being talked about, and really the way I think about methods usually is really to go back to even the data generating process, right? Thinking about the uncertainty and how we can, really get it right, because polling is about getting it right. That's the hard part. And there's a great story about polling, and Bruno can tell more about France, because apparently, not as bad as these 2 stories I'm gonna tell you. But polling was really about, really started like as a science in the 1950s in the University of Michigan, University of Maryland, and there are 2 stories in the U.S. that were really tough, right? So in 1936. There's this, I don't know if you can call it, well, I guess it's an electoral poll, but it wasn't scientific, that this newspaper, or magazine actually, called the Literary Digest, conducted, and they always did for a few elections, and this is the result that they were, publishing. That Landon, the Republican, was going to win with 57%, and then Roosevelt with 43%. There you go. And what happens is, in the election, results come, Roosevelt has 62% and Landon 38. As you can tell, 19 points, not great. This is just a disaster. Do I have the slide here? Maybe not. Well, here. So the story of the magazine, this is their cover, is our face red. So it's really tough talking to clients, to the public, if your polls are wrong. And the true story is that a year later, the magazine basically ran out of business. Like, this is really, reputation really matters when you're doing electoral polls. And the second story, well, my slides are all, okay. So the second story is 1948. The Chicago Tribune, Daily Tribune, the newspaper, published, I think, the night before or a couple of days before, the headline, Dewey defeats Truman. Like, Dewey is the candidate, and then this is Truman holding the newspaper, as in, look, the newspaper said I was going to lose, and here I am as the winner. So these 2 stories, these 2 elections, really created a movement for the universities, for companies, to really study electoral polling, right? Survey research and electoral polling as a consequence. So this is really like horror stories. You don't want to be on this side. And, well, So the first, like, I think, I don't know, I'm sure a lot of you are taking Bruno's class on survey. There's a huge difference, right? So the very first poll in terms of sampling, it's what we call a convenience sample, and we know, because we know what we call the frames, right? The lists that people had from sampling individuals. It was basically people who had a telephone. This is 1938, so people who had a telephone, people who were affiliated with a professional association, and people who subscribed to a magazine. And when we look at this sample, especially 1938, this is a really rich sample, right? So these people are like wealthy. And American people, well, in general, if you're wealthy in the US, you vote Republican. So no wonder they thought, the Republican candidate was going to win by a landslide, okay? And then, a few decades later, we realize, or we as researchers, how we have to change everything. We need to think much more about randomness, right? So your sample, the quality of your sample, to have good estimates, to have correct inference making, like, it's better, right? The appropriate is a random sample because it would then reflect, at least in terms of probability terms, the true population, right? And then there's like a whole literature and a whole methods that I'm sure Bruno's teaching a lot more. I'm going to touch on a few topics, but basically you want to have, have access to the entire electorate or the population, depending what you're polling, because you might want to just poll the electorate, and an equal chance of selection, right? So that's the whole point of the randomness here. Right, so there's two great lessons here from these two stories, right? So the first one is not really about numbers. It's about how good your sample is. So the first story, they sampled over 2 million people. Right? There's no sampling of 2 million people these days. And really, because it doesn't matter, we reach a point where the number of respondents after 2, 3, 5,000, it really won't matter that much. So it's not about the number of respondents, but it's about who I talk to, right? And how I select individuals I'm going to respond to. And the second one is, and this is very important for electoral polling, is when. When do you talk to people? Because as I'm going to show you, in a bunch of slides, especially polling in Brazil or Latin American countries, is really hard because people change their minds, right? And change the very last minute. So this is really important, when you talk to people. And I talked a little bit about the US, but the reality is, we have 1936 over there, 1948, that polling was really bad. But after that, starting 58 and then 60 and so on, the amount of error, right? So the distance between what polls were saying and the actual result were very small, right? So the results were really close to the final result of the election. And this is basically because of science, right? So you develop methods, you do a much better job at what you're doing, and you get really good results. And the interesting part is 2016, when Donald Trump was elected, polls actually weren't that wrong or off about the national estimates, but they did a poor job in certain states, right? So this is from the Association of Public Opinion Research. They did a task force in 2016, and this is the results. They have this great graph, but I love to see, that story. This is science, right? Drop the mic, and this is what science does. But this story about good electoral polling tends to be a story, there's a bunch of differences across countries, but the story is that electoral polls tend to be very close to the final result. It is a little harder in terms of presidential systems. There's a lot more variation than parliamentary systems. But when you get close to election day, polls tend to be very correct, or close to being correct, right? It's always in terms of numbers and certainty. And so this is from a paper that studies, all electoral polls and a bunch of years. But the result, as a whole, is that the field does a really good job, right? Again, there's differences across countries, across companies, and so on. But electoral polling is successful. And the crazy thing is that electoral polling and survey research more broadly is not exactly designed to forecast, right, to tell the future. Polling and survey research as a whole is much more about the limitation of the moment you're serving and the population that you're serving, right, the people you're talking to. So the way we say in Portuguese is diagnóstico, não prognóstico, right? So it's more about, I'm telling you about the present and not so much about the future. So, or another way to put it, it's a picture of a longer film, right? So it's happening in a movie, and we're just taking a picture. But as much as I can say this, the reality is people don't care, okay? So when you have a poll, people are going to see, okay, what the result says and how close it is to the result of the election. This is the reality. Journalists, the public, they're going to read them as an attempt to forecast, to tell what the final result's going to be, okay? And this is really challenging because you really have to think about it, not as in a way just to say, oh, am I doing a good job? But am I doing a good job enough to forecast, right? So there's a different element of electoral polling that is a little bit different from just survey research, opinion research, because you're not polling the day of the election unless there's what we call exit polls, right? So boca de urna for Brazil. Right? So you're polling the day of the election when people are getting to vote or when they're leaving. So that's exit polls tend to be very precise. But when I'm talking about electoral polling, I'm thinking the days before. So this is hard. This is from my experience. So I didn't tell you guys. So I work at a company called Quaest. It's one of the main or largest research firms in Brazil, and it's tough. It is really tough. So how can we improve it? And the beautiful thing is, like public opinion research, especially in Europe, in the US, Brazil a little less, like there's tons of theory. And I love this picture for a few reasons. First, because there's two sorts of problem. There you go. There is representation in terms of sampling, and there's measurement. So I don't know. I really like this picture. Like you should always look at it, try to figure out where you are, what is the source of your error, where it's coming. So I'm gonna come back to I think 2 more slides. And the reason why I'm like, when we usually think of the problems with polling in terms of sampling, and that is mostly correct, but not necessarily. Okay. And so for Bruno's clear students who are taking his class, you have seen this before. You have talked about the different coverage error, sampling error, I can tell. And so there's a whole bunch of discussions of where is your error. In the media, people won't talk about it, right? People, you're just doing it wrong, and you're clearly wrong, and things are tough. But the beautiful thing of a summer school like this in methods and science and researchers is that we ask questions to figure out where we are, right? So is my problem in terms of coverage, right? It's like, for example, in Brazil, we might have problems because the census is not updated, right? So we don't have full information about like the entire country, but even specific states, right? So states where there's more migration and so on, you might have coverage error. Well, there's other sources of coverage error, and I'll get to it. There's sampling error, and that's more like to the actual work of electoral posters. Are you sampling correct? And then again, there's a bunch of examples that I'm sure Bruno talks about. And then there's one that is sort of the new problem that people are talking a lot about it, which is non-response error. So non-response error, it's much harder to capture. There are a bunch of studies, but it's harder to capture. And this is what Americans, at least, are really talking about. In Brazil, it became like one topic of discussion in the first round. We still haven't, finished the results to actually tell, is this the source? But this is an important potential source of problem. And then we have adjustment errors in terms of more weights. And I'm going to talk just a little bit about measurement, but more because you just got to be careful with certain things. There's also a bunch of literature and questionnaire design, how to approach individuals, and so on. But again, like if you remember total survey error, the framework, I always go back to it. This is from what I've been studying, sampling, 11 years ago, 12 years ago. But so how can we improve it, right? And I'm going to talk about 7 ideas. They're really simple, and they are really trying to address the limitations. So I'm going to talk about the limitation and the ideas, right? So the first thing, and especially for countries like ours, Brazil or Latin American countries in general, it's really hard to get vote intention data right? Like people, and this is why, right? Especially early on. Like when you're really far from the election, it's really hard for your data, for the results to be close to what's going to happen in the end, okay, to election day. And so this is an example. This is 2 months before the election in Rio last year, the governor election in Rio. And basically 78% of people didn't know who they were voting for. Like 78% hadn't chosen a candidate. This is really hard. Like, this is, in the US, this is almost impossible because you usually have the incumbent and the challenger, right? So you only have usually 2 candidates. But in Brazil, like major state, people really don't know who they're voting for. And this is really hard, right? So for a few more months, like you see how the line goes down and people will figure it out. This is what we call the spontaneous, right? So we're not listing the candidates, but this is a sign that this is going to be a tough election to predict because people don't know. People probably don't know the candidates. And same thing here for the state of São Paulo. So this is, a poll from Quaest, again, 2 months before the election. And we ask people, do you know this candidate called Tarcísio de Freitas? 2/3 of the electorate didn't know who Tarcísio was. And Tarcísio ends up winning, right? So your poll 2 months before, there's no way you're going to get the final result correct if people don't know who the candidates are, right? Even the governor, like the governor wasn't elected before, he was the vice governor, but also the 2 candidates who were fighting for a spot in the runoff were known. People just don't know them. So voting intention, and this is what the media usually reports on, like is really limited early on. So you got to really be careful. And one way to think about this is that look for things that go beyond vote intention, right? So how much people are known, how much people are rejected or candidates are rejected. Like this information is going to tell you a lot more about the potential growth and so on, right? So a lot of the polls show tons of more information about candidates, what people are talking about, than just vote intention. And the second one, this is, again, about great to be here in the summer school because this is, again, what we're trained for, but journalists are not, the public is not, and it's about uncertainty, right? So statistics is really about uncertainty, and how we calculate them and how we report them is really important, but it's really hard because people and journalists do not really follow, right? So we usually say there's a margin of error of 2 points up or down or things like that, and this is a function of a few things, right? So the number of responses, but also what kind of sampling you're doing. So the way we calculate margin of error is different if you're doing telephone, if you're doing face-to-face, how you're doing face-to-face also might change. So there's a bunch of things that should go into the margin of error, but as a whole, and I'm talking about myself, we don't actually portray as we should. And this is hard because we might be misleading the public, misleading journalists, and this is a problem that we need to address. And this is not only Brazil, this is the US and so on. So this is important. So why do we say usually, like the margin of error is 2 points or 2%, but 2 points up or down? And that really has to do with if you have a statistic at the 50%, and then you, like, according to your sample size, you calculate the margin of error, but that's really simplistic. This is really, really simplistic. If you're doing stratified cluster sampling, it's a lot more complicated. And again, the market, right, firms do not necessarily do a good job portraying that. If your statistic is much closer to 0 or much close to 100, your confidence is going to be much larger. Your margin of error tends to be much smaller. So again, and we don't really talk about it. Again, it's hard. We know it's hard. But as researchers, people who do social science, it's something that we ought to talk about and find ways to do this, right? And I think this is a general problem. But like one thing that we've been doing at Quaest is trying to have different confidence intervals for different estimates. Right? I don't want to show the 2%. That might not make any sense, right? So this is a national poll from Brazil, and you have the different regions. And by just the size of the population, our estimates of the Southeast, so it's the second column over there, because we poll a lot more people in the Southeast where there are more people in the population, the confidence interval is much smaller, right? We have more confidence about those estimates, especially when compared to the Center-West or the North, where we're sampling actually just 150 people or 200 people, right? So our confidence is not as high. So, this is, again, journalists and so on, but research specifically should be careful with things like that. So this one is actually very close to the number 3 and again number 7, but poll as close to the election as possible and even as often as possible because you learn a lot more from more data, right? So this is kind of obvious, but I mean this especially important in Brazil for 2 reasons. The latest elections have been tougher because, so this is, I always like to talk about this, it's harder to do polling in Latin America than in Europe, even though France is not at the easiest case, because of partisanship, right? So in political science, I don't know how many political scientists, but if you have high rates of partisanship, people who identify with the party, it's much easier to do the polls because people know who they're voting for. Well, I identify with the PT, I'm probably going to vote for the PT. The problem is Brazil has very low rates of partisanship. Latin America, Peru is crazy, Mexico a little bit better, but it's really hard, right? So people don't identify with the party, they decide very late. So in 2018, the head of the CEO of Ibope, one of the largest firms, said that 34% was decided in the very last days of the election. This is for the presidential election, right? So the most talked about, people are talking about the election, and 1/3 of the electorate is really deciding in the last days. And this is something really cool that has been happening in the last elections, is that you can also just go to Google Trends, go to Google, and put the name of the candidates and how much people are Googling their names and their numbers. So this is really important, because if people don't know who they're voting for, and they're getting informed in the last minute, you should try to use Google to try to figure it out. This is not extremely scientific yet, but basically we're being able to show that the candidates who are improving from the day before the election to the election day are being Googled more than the candidates who are not, okay? So, but at the same time, just be careful, because in the 2020 municipal election in São Paulo, there was a candidate called Márcio França, so France, and the thing is, France was playing Portugal during the day before the election. So for a moment, I was like, what's happening? You know, everybody's Googling Márcio França, but actually people were talking about the game. So anyways, just a funny story that Google also has some limitations. But in 2022, people Googled more Bolsonaro than Lula, which is, you know, a light indication, but again, an indication that he might perform better than he was doing in the polls. Tebet also performed better than Ciro, which again also went the same way. Oops. All right, so this is a poll from Quaest that we did as well. I think this is 3 months before the election, but nobody knew, federal deputies. It's really hard to predict, especially other offices, right? So we're talking about presidential and gubernatorial races. We kind of do a better job, but when you get to senatorial races, to federal deputies, much, much harder. And then you need to do a much better in terms of the size of your survey sampling or your measurement and so on. So I'm not even talking about those, because those are even harder. And then this is really simple, right? Quality. Pay attention to quality. But as much as simple as it is, it's not necessarily the case that all firms are doing a good job and thinking about quality as much as they should. And quality matters, right, in everything, but especially in electoral polling. So I'm not going to bring a bunch of metrics about a bunch of firms and so on, especially because, I'm part of one, so I'll be biased. But there's a bunch of variation, right? So firms that are running same methods are finding different results. We also have, this is when I said that I was going to talk about, sampling or coverage error. In terms of coverage error, we also know that face-to-face, so presencial, we have a harder time finding rich people, when telephone polls and online polls have a harder time talking to poor people, right? So that's coverage error. You're not having access to the people you should be talking to, right? And the reason why I can tell you, or you should, people should know, or I look at polls pretty often, is that face-to-face, Lula always performs, the PT candidate, the left candidate, performs better than telephone polls. And this is a sign, because poor voters are voting for the left. So again, quality will matter because of variation, but also quality in the different modes, right? So if you're doing face-to-face, telephone, or online. So again, quality matters. And again, why I told you I was going to bring this back. Quality matters in every step of the way. It really does. And I can tell you that, I've been talking a lot about sampling, but in terms of the response, how people are asking the question, if the respondent, is being misled by some way or being biased or because of what the interviewer is doing, or the quality of the question, if you're showing the response options. There's a bunch of things in terms of here that we just don't pay attention, right? Firms are doing, and at Quaest, we're a new firm. We're really investing in this because quality matters. There's a few studies showing how quality might not matter as much for the final estimate, but it matters of your confidence, how much you trust your result, because you might just introduce a lot of noise. And noise is just random error, which your standard errors will increase a lot. So I'm assuming you guys have taken Glauco's course on early stats. And then processing error is important, and then weights as well. So quality really matters. Again, this is obvious, but it's something to think about. It's really something to think about. And so this paper came out 4 days ago. This is the most recent paper on online sampling in Latin America. So this is from scholars at LAPOP, Vanderbilt. And they are basically starting a conversation in Latin America because online sampling, online polls, is being done a ton in Europe and the US. And the literature is really improving. People are studying a lot. It's sort of a convenient sample, but you're studying ways to be more representative or even random sample. But in Latin America, this is really hard because we're poor. Because not everyone has access to internet, to telephones, because we usually respond in telephones. And even when we try to do stats, right, so we try to increase or use weights or sample matching, this is not fixing. This is what the researchers are telling us. Because you might have, my sample looks good in terms of, female and male, region, and so on. But the quality of your sample, of people you're talking to, or even the people who have access to, because we call panel online samples, in Latin America, this is just still not as great as it is in other regions of the world. So this really matters. And so bad news, because online samples, online polls are faster and less expensive. But the result apparently is not as great. So again, in terms of mode, this really matters, right? So I think this is a call for researchers in Latin America to really work on sampling if you're doing online polls. And again, because we're talking so much about sampling and good sampling, there's a bunch of techniques also to assess how good your sample is. You can look at, things that you're doing, not only your quotas, right, or demographics, does it represent the population? But what people have also been using is what we call benchmarks. So the idea here is that if I do a sample, right, and my sample is really good, I should see some results that I'm not designing my sample to reflect, but that the sample reflects the population. So let me try to be a little more clear. So let's say, this is a good benchmark a few years ago. Vaccination rates was something that the government is collecting data every single day and reporting on. So we knew day by day what percentage of the population is getting vaccinated. So we knew, it's 10%, 20%, 30%. And when we do a poll, we're not looking to have, or as quotas, or looking to have people necessarily who are vaccinated. We're just interviewing people. But we ask them, have you been vaccinated? And what we do is we look at the results that we have from the sample and the results from the government, what the government is portraying. So we can compare and see, does our samples, is it close to reflecting what the population sort of looks like in that way? So it's something that is external to what you're actually interested in, but it's a benchmark, right? So it's not easy to have benchmarks as good as that one, but you can use benchmarks to assess your sample. And there's other techniques than weighting. There's a new technique that we've been using a lot. It's called Mr. P, which is multi-level post-stratification weighting. It's another technique that people are using in the US, really matters, but it's something to think about. And remember how I said that it's really hard because we got to predict the future, right? It's about forecasting. It's not just about how the world looks like. So this leaves sort of the world of survey research and gets to the world of forecasting, which is a little bit different. Sort of the ideas are different. But the way to think about this is, okay, so I have what we call the survey statistic, right? So I have a number here from my data. Well, I want to know if it's going to go up or down, and then you're going to do this according to usually a model, right? Or one way. There are many models how to do this, but the important part is there's different logics that you want to think about. Like, why is this voter or this candidate going up or going down based on something, right? So this was really sort of expanded in the 2012, 2008 with Nate Silver. I don't know if you guys heard of him. 538. He has a website in the US that forecasts everything. But he sort of pushed sort of the agenda in terms of forecasting models. The summer school didn't have this year, but had in the past a class just on forecasting. So you could take Bruno's class on surveying and then a class on forecasting because it's a little bit different. Again, you not only want to look at your sample, but you want to think about different things, right? And be smart about it. So Nate Silver has a book, and he says the thing about like forecasters is that you should not like be afraid of it. You should like try to, I don't know, gather as much information and then be smart about it. So it's a different logic. And this has been done in Brazil already a few ways. So the first way is what we call poll aggregations, right? So you have different firms conducting different polls. And what people are doing and the media outlets are doing is also aggregating different polls. So you have the Ibope poll, you have the Quaest poll, you have, I don't know, Paraná Pesquisa poll. And what people are doing is, okay, let's put them together and sort of aggregate. Because the idea is, if you're doing various good polls, so this is the most important assumption. If the polls are really good, right, and they are just representative samples, if you do more polls, by probability, you're going to get a better estimate. There's a huge assumption there that all polls are good, which, again, there's tons of variation. But, again, this is hard. Forecasting is hard. And so what people would do, and Nate Silver, they might give different weights to different polling firms, right? So if you trust Datafolha, you put more weight. So you say, Datafolha is probably correct, so I'm just going to adjust. So this is a different technique that people are doing. Nate Silver does a little bit different. He not only looks at polls, but he truly uses statistics in terms of simulations of different results. So the idea is, let's say I have Ibope is the largest firm in Brazil, and samples every state, right? You ask, are you voting for Lula or Bolsonaro? In every single state. So what Nate Silver would do, he would look at each of those samples per state and calculate simulations. So let's say the Ibope poll is wrong by 2 points for Lula or 2 points for Bolsonaro, and run a bunch of simulations. So this is really like R, Python based that you're running, or it could be Stata, or that doesn't matter. But you're running simulations of different potential outcomes to sort of get a number. And this is like really interesting because when we think of survey or polling, we usually think of voting intention, right? So what percentage candidate A is going to get, candidate B is going to get, and candidate C is going to get. So that's one statistic, right? So that's vote percentage. But when we talk about models are not so much about how one outcome could be vote intention. But in this case, what we're trying to predict is what are the chances of Biden winning. Not how many votes Biden's going to get, but the chance of Biden winning, even if it's 50.001 to 49.99, right? So it's a different statistic. It's sort of the logistic regression, the probability regression. So it's not so much about the vote intention, but it's more about probability of an event occurring, right? So it's, again, a different way to think about elections, more about probability rather than vote intention. So again, you're moving from just polling research, survey research, to modeling. And guys, like I should have said this before, I don't have answers, okay? So I'm bringing you questions, I'm bringing you ideas. I'm sure Bruno has answers to everything. But being this like a school of methods, it's more like provoking or, motivating you to think about these things. Because one way or another, you're going to face this. And next year, we have tons of electoral polling in Brazil, and you're going to have tons of polling everywhere. So it's just something to think about. And again, even talk about at the bar table, and having lunch with your family. These things matter because people, don't have the chance to study survey research or electoral polling as we do here. So, and the last part is, this is, again, I think the latest thing that we really need to study in Brazil, and we're seeing more of an impact, is strategic voting, so voto útil, and abstention. And the story is that, like, the history says that Brazil, like, we usually don't think much about abstention, which it was kind of okay when you have, like, participation rates at 90%, 85%, but what we're seeing is participation rates going down. So the question is, who is not going to vote, right? Because that matters. If the people who are not voting are different from the people who are voting, and you're not taking into account in your sampling or your survey, you might get it wrong, right? So you might even be talking to the right people because they believe they're going to vote, and they might even tell you, I'm going to vote, but that's not necessarily the case. In the U.S., people have done studies that show that about 10% of the population say that they voted or that they're going to vote, but they do not in the end of the day. And, you know, again, Americans have been so, like, focused on this that we know that it's usually poor voters who vote Democrat. So how much participation you have in an election really matters in that sense, because you might be biased against Democrats in the U.S. In Brazil, we have really good indications that Lula sort of performs worse, right, gets less votes if abstentions was higher, right? So more abstention, worse for Lula. A source of error that we kind of knew and we have, like, information about, but we're not necessarily taking that into account when we're reporting polling or forecasting the result. See what I'm saying? Like, if you focus too much on your sampling and you think it's great, but you're not thinking about the people who are not going to vote, this might matter. And perhaps even more important, and again, for the political scientists in the room, strategic voting is something that, you know, from Anthony Downs, from Duverger, I don't know how to, sorry, Bruno, I don't know how to pronounce it. Duverger. Strategic voting makes sense, right? So we want voters, if they think that their favorite candidate's not going to win, we want them to move on to, it's a little more normative than I would say, but, you know, it's sort of expected, it would be rational for them to move candidates, change candidates to a candidate that, you know, might be their second option. And again, electoral polls, there's a huge discussion, and we can talk more about it, how electoral polls influence the electorate. And again, sure, like, there might be a problem, but that might actually be what we want. We want voters to know who has a better chance of winning, so they choose the candidate that has a better chance of going to the second round, of winning the whole election, right? So strategic voting is not necessarily bad. It actually might be good. So more information might be really good for these voters because they avoid the most rejected candidate, for instance, right? So again, strategic voting is important, and we have now just two papers, recent papers, really showing evidence of strategic voting happening in Brazil. Okay, so we know this is happening. Again, we don't know how much each election happens. What we have learned from the second paper on the right here is that voters who have more information do more strategic voting, which, again, makes sense, as I was saying before. And we know, again, in the first round of 2018, people doing strategic voting. This is a new paper. And so that matters. Again, you might say, oh, Guilherme, this is a problem because if I want to vote for a candidate and the other candidate's polling better, like, you don't have to change your vote. But this is an option, right? So you're free to choose. And as much as the two sides have, like, criticisms and so on, but more information, I think, as a general, is good for the voter. And especially for another reason, this is just something that really, I think, is really important these days, is more polls are better because of fake news, right? So last year in Brazil, there was discussion, should we stop doing polling 10 days, 2 weeks before the election? And I can tell you from experience, politicians will say, if voters don't have information, they'll create information, fake information, to help them, right? So people say, oh, no, it's a private poll. You guys are not getting because it's a private poll, it's not public, but I actually am doing so much better, you should vote for me, which might not be the case, right? So fake news, very current topic, and it happens a lot in terms of electoral polling. And this is something that, again, a technique that is being used in the US, I'm sure in France, some version of it, but this is really new in Brazil. I think we were, like, truly the first one to actually do it in Brazil, the likely voter model, which is, again, we know that not everyone is voting. Some people might not vote, and the hard part is a lot of people say, I'm going to vote. I'm sure I'm going to vote, and they won't. So the U.S., again, being the case, much more studied, and because I studied in the U.S., so I know this literature well. But basically, what we've been doing is we look at the data, and then you can use different information from actual participation data from the Superior Electoral Tribune, or you can use from previous elections. You can even ask people, and this is how Gallup does. It says, how much are you interested in the election? How likely are you to vote? Are you talking about the election? So there's a bunch of ways that you can do what we call likely voter models. And that tries to correct for people who might not show up. Again, modeling, not so much just the survey as a whole. Again, because electoral poll is not only about the survey, it's also about getting it right, which, I don't know, it's fun but hard at the same time. So I'm sure Bruno has tons of more experience and will give us tons of lessons and ideas.
So thanks very much, Guilherme. You have given an amazing overview of the main big issues, particularly the recent issues in doing electoral surveys. I'm going to take some of your points and I'm going to react. My first point is you are absolutely right. In the beginnings of its talk, he was telling us how tough it could be to do polling, and particularly electoral polling. It is absolutely true that it is super difficult, technically speaking. And also, as a profession and as an activity, because actually it is one of the rare research activity where you have confrontation with the reality. On the day of the election, you get it in your face, okay? And you have a direct confrontation with the reality. And it is probably the reason why that many people are wondering, oh, the polls are going to get wrong again and again, because they know that actually at the end of the day, they will be the truth, actually. And it is part of the exciting part of doing electoral polling. We are like people that do like to have dangerous activities. You know that some people that are enjoying having dangerous sport activities. It is dangerous sport activity to do pre-election survey. It can put your professional reputation in danger. There are huge financial consequences for the pollster who is getting wrong. On the next day, if you are failing, you are losing plenty of clients. Yeah. Plenty. People are saying, oh, I don't want to work with someone who is unreliable, and they break contracts. I know a couple of stories like that in France that happen. So, yes, it's a very, very hard activity, a very dangerous activity, but that danger is part of the excitement, which is the paradox of life. If you want to have an exciting life, at one said you need a bit of spice, which is there. And it is very spicy, actually, doing electoral polling. It is absolutely true that we have this experience that people are always saying, oh, yes, you are going to get wrong again. Okay, particularly after Trump, after the Brexit, Trump plus Brexit, for most people, they were saying, oh, the polls are always wrong. I can tell you that right after the Brexit, we've got a year later, we've got the presidential election in France in 2017. And we were doing a big panel survey in my institute. We are doing a big panel survey, and I've got an agreement with one of the main TV channel in France. Every time that we are publishing one wave of the panel, I was invited on their TV show to comment, actually live, the result of the panel study. And every time I was coming on the TV place, they were saying, oh, it's going to get wrong again, don't you think so? And I was saying, no, I'm sorry, I believe that we are going to get it right. The last wave of the panel was on the election day. Okay, we could publish that next day. Election is on Sunday. We could publish the wave on Monday, and we were so accurate that when I came to the TV, it was like a red carpet. Red carpet, really. Oh, you did a fantastic work, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so this is the kind of thing that we are habituated to. Why is it like that? Aside the fact that we do enjoy playing with that feeling that it's going to fail, maybe, okay, it is exciting. Aside from that, the main reason why, this is my experience, that was one of the main points of Guilherme's talk, which is that question of sampling and estimating. Actually, these words, sampling, estimating, for us are absolutely synonymous. If you are sampling, you are estimating. And so it is so difficult to explain to people what does it mean exactly to estimate, and that by definition, an estimate is volatile. It fluctuates. During the last week class, I did explain to the student the difference between an estimator and an estimate. That the day you go on the field, you are going to generate a numerical estimate of the estimator. But actually, the estimate of the estimator is only one among the infinite number of estimated values of the estimator. So it is so tricky to explain to people that most people do not fully understand the meaning of that, that for us, when you see all these data points around the fitted line, it's absolutely normal. Not only it is absolutely normal, but it is a fundamental aspect of sampling and estimating. Okay? We are habituated to, in our lives, actually, sampling and estimating is actually a daily activity that we have. I was taking the example in the class. I'm going to a supermarket, and suddenly I see a price which is not the expected one. I want to buy tomato sauce, and it is a bit more expensive than I am habituated to. Is it by luck? Does it tell me that that supermarket I can't trust on them? I will never come back? So when I am wondering that, actually my brain is actually making a sampling, a typical estimating and sampling activity. I just think immediately to the so numerous occasions in my life where I did buy tomato sauce in a supermarket. And I try to fix immediately if it is a long distance to the habitual price or it is tolerable. After all, it could be a bit more expensive than my habitude, but my habitude would cost me too much. I need to take my car to go to a new shop and blah, blah, blah. So this is about that sampling and estimating. Basically speaking, it is in the fundamental essence of an estimate to fluctuate. Okay, the problem is not the fluctuation. The problem is going to be the magnitude of that fluctuations, their significance, their eventual trends. Does it indicate that something is really getting on? Okay, we got that experience since the recent weeks. I guess that in Brazil it's the same as in Europe, where you have inflation because of the Ukraine war and the energy crisis. So you never know exactly if it is the end of that dynamics of inflation or if we have stabilization now, okay, which is exactly the same kind of problems that we are talking about, okay? So the question of the quality of the sample is absolutely fundamental, like it was said. Some people, they were telling me one day, we were talking with an American colleague, and we were wondering, if I have an allocated budget to do a survey, what do I prefer? Do I prefer an excellent sample but with a poor questionnaire, or the exact opposite? Okay, if I need to allocate my budget, human resource to do the good questionnaire or the good sample. Okay, and we were saying good sample, I think, because bad questionnaire at one stage, I'm going to catch something from the reality, because we are working on phenomena that are very resilient to the indicators. If you are working on political attitudes, it's so resilient to the questions that you can draft that after all, you can identify if someone is a conservative person or not, even with not a good indicator. But bad sample is going to make having a terrible effect in what we are doing. So the question of the quality of the sample is directly connected to the question of the mode of interview. It was said that web interviews became extremely popular in the community of pollsters. In my country, I would say that now 100% of the political surveys and political polls are doing by web surveys. We have a different perspective because what we are getting is that using the web surveys, we have a better estimate of the far right. Because people have not the social desirability bias. You talk to your computer, why would you lie to your computer? My computer is my friend. I'm not going to lie to my computer. It's not at all like face-to-face interview. So since that we are doing web surveys for pre-election studies, we have quite good estimation of the far-right candidates. Even, not only it's good quality, but we have quasi no longer to wait, post-ratification waiting of Marine Le Pen, the leader of the far-right, quasi nothing. So, but anyway, it is raising the question of the quality of the databases to do web surveys and what the pollsters are calling access panel, with a big difference between the pollsters that are the owners of their access panel. They know exactly what is their database of email addresses. They know that they are not going to solicitate too much people. If we want to have good quality interviews, we need to avoid the professional, people that become full-time professional to respond to questions. So this is a very strategic issue, which is the quality of the access panel and also the fact that people are not overexposed to respond to questions, obviously. There is another point that I do like a lot in your talk, which is the question of estimating and forecasting. Election studies and electoral surveys have that particularity that forecasting is obviously a very important point. The media attention, the citizen attention is about forecasting. You want to know who is going to win the election. And the pollsters have this dual or paradoxical reputation. They are like a magician. They know the secrets. They are closing the doors and they know who is going to be the winner of the election. They don't want to tell you exactly. And at the same time, they manipulate the good citizen. The good citizen would be the one which is avoiding the polling and which is quietly looking to, it is choosing the executive. So let's read the programs that people are not doing. I can tell you that even in academia, I know quite a lot of good political scientists that don't read in the details the program of the candidates. So if we are not doing that ourselves, why would we expect the citizen to do it? And we have exactly the same issue about avoiding polling before the election. And every time that you have an election, you have some pressure groups that are saying we should ban polls before the election because it contaminates the quality of the public debate. The citizens are too much influenced by the polls. And we have also always, people like you and me, we have always the same response. Okay, but let's ban also the media and the newspaper because also the columnist, the journalist influence. And I can tell you that when you participate to media activities, certainly it's your case, we know if you just look to the script of the screen of a journalist, where you have second by second what is going to happen in the news, you could see that they can obviously, if they want, manipulate public opinion also to put this on the top with a long sequence of seconds when another issue is going to be at the end of the news. And so why not to ban also the media, the newspapers, the columnists? Why the pollsters only, the only ones? Okay? And frankly speaking, I'm exactly like you. I'd prefer polling than fake news. Okay? But it is raising another issue, which is the quality of the information of the public regarding the polls. And you are right, there is a big deal on that. The British Polling Association, they did a fantastic document, which is about 20 pages, which is how to learn to the journalists to read pre-election polling. And there is still a huge effort, okay? Many journalists, many experts even don't know how to read a poll. They are not aware of estimating, for instance. They are not aware of what does it mean, margin of error, okay? And so there is a huge effort which needs to be done on the backgrounds of the journalists, of the media. We had a big discussion on that over the last presidential election in France. And at one stage, I proposed to one of the main quality newspapers in France quite a big article that was about what big mistake should we avoid when we are reading polls. Okay? I've got some very positive reactions on that on the pollsters, with one exception. But I've got very positive reactions of the pollster. And we are making a lot of progress now on that. Most of the pollsters in France, and I can see from your graphic that it is the same in Brazil, they are presenting their voting intentions with the margin of error, which is there, which is an absolutely essential element of information, because this confidence interval is going to be a very interesting information for you to read what is going on. And if you see that two margins of error overlap, okay, it's a very important information. Some people are going to say that you can only use margin of error and confidence intervals if you are getting and if you are running random samples. It's true. The statistical theory is saying that you can calculate that, providing that you know exactly who is missing and that you have a random error, that you have a random sample, in other words. The practical things that we are doing is that we are publishing that anyway, even if we would use quota samples, even if we have stratified samples. It is true that if you have stratified sample, you need to do something that some specialized software can calculate the margin of error once that you take into account the design of your sample and the stratification of your sample. And it was one of the objectives of the summer school to learn that. But there is, frankly speaking, it's still a very big deal, which is to improve the awareness of the journalists, the media, and the citizens on how to read a poll. For me, it should be a quasi-civic education element to learn the citizen very early how to read information, not only polls, but information, what we call numerical literacy. Because numerical literacy is obviously an element of citizen empowerment. To get autonomy when you read the news, when you read the polls, to be an autonomous citizen is probably the best way to fight against fake news. Okay. Another point that I do like in what you are saying about, it's about how to measure voting intentions. Measuring correctly voting intention can't be a single item. It's not, for whom would you like to vote in the next election? No. I identify at least 5-6 questions that you need to raise and ask if you want to correctly measure voting intention. Interest in the election. So the motivation of the citizen. Are you interested by the election? Are you interested by the campaign, which is a different topic? You could be interested by the election, but you find the campaign is very poor. Okay? So interest in the election, interest in the campaign, the probability to participate that should be asked before the voting intention question. We are using a 0 to 10 point scaling, and the attitude is that when we are publishing voting intention, we are making the difference between the the certain voter that have declared a score of 9 or 10. Okay? And if you are using correctly the polls, you could see that if you are fixing that a certain voter is between 8 to 10 or 9 to 10 or only 10, it's not the same story. So probability to vote, like that, you can filter when you do the data analysis, and you can look to who is a certain voter and what are the voting intentions among that population. Particularly, Guilherme was saying, point number one, that you should be very careful about voting intention a long, long time before the election. Because a long time before the election, no one gets interested by the election. You and me, we are, but not the rest of the population, most of them. So interest in the election, interest in the campaign, probability to vote, hesitation about the choice, voting intention. Once that people are declaring their voting intention, the certainty to vote for that candidate. And eventually, I could add another element, which is something which is quite close to the likely voter, but it's a little bit different, which is what we are calling the PTVs. What the specialists of elections are calling the PTVs are actually the probabilities to vote, PTV. Rather than asking for whom would you like to vote, and you propose a list of candidates, then you are going to ask the probability to vote for each candidate. In other words, you invent a research design which is considering that for you, voting is a multi-dimensional space and not a unique dimensional space. You consider that people, if they could, we could have a voting system where people have as much voting bulletin as candidates. And why not? We have some countries where actually voting is you go to the polling station and you can list a set of names. And after all, we could do so in ascending order. My first candidate, number one, is that one, but if he's losing, number two is that one. So in measuring the PTVs, then it changes completely the picture, okay? And it makes the story completely different, okay? And if you have that, it becomes super interesting to study particularly voting intention dynamics during the campaign. You could see what candidates become more popular, less popular. You could see also voting transitions between one candidate to another one. So actually, it's a tool to study also strategic voting, because it is absolutely certain that we have a problem with strategic voters. It happened 2 times in France in the last 2 presidential elections. The candidate of the far left became the leader of the left. And 2 times in 2017 and in 2022, the far left candidate is going, during the last weeks, the 2 or 3 last weeks, is going to fully benefit from strategic voting, because leftist voters, they are so desperate about the ecologist candidate, about the socialist candidate, that at one stage they want to save the face of the left. They don't like the far left candidate, by the way. Too much aggressive, they are saying, too much leftist, too much radical, maybe, but it's going to save the face of the left. And so it's going to fully benefit from strategic voting. It's a super interesting phenomenon. Strategic voter is not necessarily a volatile voter. The volatile voter could be a voter which is completely lost in the game, responding to a question by chance, by random. 10 years ago, we did an experiment. We were having a panel survey with many waves. And every time that we would identify in the panel someone who is changing at least 2 times the voting intention, we were putting that individual aside, and we were getting a telephone interview, which is, oh, you did participate in the polling, we have seen some hesitation. Well, can you tell something about that? To understand if it is an hesitation which is motivated, or if it is, I'm completely lost. And actually, I am responding to your questionnaire by random. Okay? After all, you could be correct by random. it happens. On the day of exam, you can be very good on the exam just by chance. Okay, it's better to work, actually. But another thing that came to my mind when I was hearing you is it's the question of predicting for different kinds of elections. Predicting and forecasting presidential election is not the same game as municipal elections or legislative ones, because in local elections, the political offer is much more diverse. You have plenty of independent candidates, local candidates, and so it's much, much more difficult. And what I know from the fails that we had in France sometimes for electoral polling, most of the time it was for local elections. For presidential election, we used to have only, I will not say that it's a fail. It was mostly a fail of correcting, in reading the polls. It was in 2002. We have a two-round system for the presidential election with majority voting system. And in 2002, the last polls are predicting a second round between the right-wing incumbent president and the left-wing incumbent prime minister. And finally, the leader of the far right is getting qualified for the second round. If you take the last published polling, the left-wing prime minister is around 17 for the first round, when the leader of the far right is around 15. So actually, if you would just apply that it is just estimates and that you calculate confidence intervals and margin of error, you could see the overlap. Okay? In the left party, the shock was so amazing shock. The candidate is eliminated by the leader of the far right. It has been a big shock. Then there was plenty of reporting and plenty of thinking about that. And what is extraordinary is that inside the Socialist Party, there was an expert on polling, and he could see the Titanic is going in the iceberg. He could see that, okay? But he pronounced a mythic sentence. He said that actually, statistically speaking, it is likely that the leader of the far right could qualify for the second round, but I cannot believe that politically speaking. So you see the as political expert, we navigate between these two things, which is we have these methodological considerations, these statistical issues, but at the same time we interpret. And so the interpretation could be the dangerous part, actually, that either you are framed in a certain context of interpretation or that you are the victim of an optimistic bias. On that day, is the victim of an optimistic bias. I cannot trust that politically speaking, but statistically speaking, this could happen. If you're a methodologist, you're afraid by that sentence, obviously. Yeah. You're just afraid by that sentence. Finally, I like that you have presented 2 times this picture that I have shown to my students, which is that mythic total error framework, which is absolutely extraordinary, because if you keep that on your desk, it's like a constant warning, the source of error. And on that graphic, you have seen that we have 2 big directions of committing error. One is about estimating, inferring, statistically speaking, which is estimating. The other one is about measuring. And we need to be as good as possible on these 2 big pillars, estimating and measuring. And each time we confront to the big paradigm of actually social sense surveys and broadly speaking methodologies, which is the question of inferring. Can we trust on the questions the indicators that we have as to be valid, reliable measures of the concept that we are interested by. On the side of estimating, can we trust on the sample statistics as good estimators of the population parameters? And the paradox of survey, which is even making the survey even more crazy, more exciting, is that many times we are wondering if the sample estimate is a correct estimator of the population parameter when I will never know the population parameter. Sometimes I'm lucky because we've got the Minister of Health, which is recording who get vaccination. Okay, so I have my population parameter. But when I am measuring xenophobia, where is the population parameter of xenophobia? I will never know. But I continue to be obsessed by the lag, by the distance between my sample statistics and the population parameter. And it is the reason why that we do like big samples and that we do like to repeat and repeat and repeat data points, because at one stage, this accumulation of knowledge is like if I would get this population parameter. It's one of the most exciting paradox of actually a quantitative method. Finally, my last point is about the question. I would like to get back on the question of forecasting and estimating. We were talking on that with Glauco and our colleagues at the lunch break, and some of us are saying that academic research is not about predicting. We are explaining. And many times, the pollster or the journalists are saying to us, too easy. Too easy. You come on the battlefield after the battle, and you said, "Oh, it was a war. that was a battle." I'm not fully like that. I believe that the duty of science is also to predict. What would you say if the planet would be hit by a meteorite and astrophysics couldn't predict? What do we get from the COVID? Lack of anticipation. In my country, few months before the COVID, they have destroyed tons of masks. Because 15 years ago, we've got the first epidemics. Okay? France decided to buy a huge stock of masks. And finally, they said, oh, that was a bad decision, because to keep masks in a very safe context, it's over. It is outdated. They have destroyed that. So I think that scientific activity needs to be predictive also. Okay? So I can see the point that prediction cannot be the only way. Okay? And that, of course. But the reason why that we are doing panel surveys in electoral studies is obviously to predict the election. It's not only to understand the electoral dynamics, because if you understand the electoral dynamics, is that at the end, you should be able to see what is going on. Maybe that we are not going to predict with an exact precision the winner of the election. But my goodness, if we are predicting that the loser was the winner and vice versa, we have a problem in the model. We have a problem in the model that we are using to understand voting behavior if we are not capable of predicting correctly who is going to be the winner of the election. So that's my points.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much for your speech, both of you. Thank you. Really was awesome. I think I have many questions to do. But we're open to the floor, so let me know if you have questions. Just raise your hand, say your name, and I don't think if they gotta use the mic. Yes, so I think you'd come here just to, or because we cannot pass the mic because we have. Just come over, please.
Like that, we have face-to-face.
So, firstly, I would like to thank both Guilherme and Bruno for the brilliant presentation. My name is João. I'm from USP. And I actually have two questions. The first one is, we as political scientists, as economists, as sociologists, we have a lot of theories about voting, explanatory theories about voting, and we say, oh, voting is about economics, voting is about public discourse, voting is about many things, but we have theories about voting. My question is, should polling companies or institutions have auxiliary models, maybe do nowcasting of economic variables, have their own models, or their own explanatory models of voting, so that they could correct the polls? Because let me give you a simple example. There were polls that were saying that the social benefit given in the year of the election wouldn't affect the vote. Afterwards, we saw the data results, and in fact, it was correlated with voting for the Bolsonaro government because he was incumbent and he was paying people. Should we trust more theory? Should we trust more the polls? What should we do? And my second question is more not exactly on the scientific aspect of polling, but on the political aspect of polling, because should we like it or not, we are political agents. We are on the public scrutiny. I would like to congratulate Guilherme and also Felipe Nunes from their patience, because there were a lot of fake news about Felipe. He was fake news as I believe a senator. I don't remember exactly. People were saying that he was working for PT, that he had eaten children whatsoever. And in fact, we are political agents as scientists. How should we address public communication and communicate exactly the uncertainty, the limitations of polling, and what we can provide information for society, in spite of what journalists want us just to say? Should we take more social media? Should we address more the attacks from the politicians? We actually were going to have a congressional committee to address polling. What should we do?
Let's make a round of questions. Okay, Thiago. Let's make 2 or 3 questions and then.
Hi, Professor. Hi, Guilherme. I came here just for you. I'm not a participant this year in the summer school. I'm a former student here, not a PhD yet for bureaucratic reasons, but first of all, I want to thank you for your presentations. But I'm thinking about a lot of things about polls, electoral polls, since the elections. But one thing that is annoying me is about the non-response rates, because the polls companies do not launch the numbers, and when you are working with good samples, even with good samples, is a huge problem, because we need to know if these no responses are correlated or not with some candidate or with some profile, because even if we pass a certificate or reweighting or other options for post-collection, we need to deal with this, and is one of the major problems when we're working with surveys. And as the poll companies do not launch these numbers, we don't know what we're dealing, and no, it's basically this about the numbers polls.
You can answer first. Who's first?
I'm going to respond to one of the 2 or 3 questions that was answered, and then about non-response. You were saying, what can we do? First, we can do a lot of things. I'm quite optimistic on what is going on. You could see that now there is really something which is citizen initiatives and also pollster initiatives. The aggregators that he was showing during the presentation is obviously something which is new and that facilitate the life of the ordinary citizens that can go. You can also look to the tendencies. You can interact with the data more and more and more. We have new facilities for the citizen to interact with the data to make your own judgment of what is going on. So I think that the good direction is probably the empowerment of the citizens and civic education about numerical literacy that I was saying. That at one stage it should be, and the media participate to that. It would be really not only an exaggeration, but probably something false to say that the media are not doing anything. Because we have this attitude that if it is not the fault of the pollster, it is the fault of the media. At least in Europe, at least in my country, the situation has really improved in the way that the media communicate about the polls. You start to have a generation of journalists that went through the same curriculum as you, academic, summer schools, and you have a new generation of journalists that are very good. If you take the case of the main quality newspaper in France, like many good quality newspapers in the world, they have a team of data analysts now. It's over the time of journalism. It's just going in the streets, going on the field, and you have in the main quality newspaper teams of data journalists. Data journalists start to be super competent. I've met some of them in the main French newspaper, quality newspaper. I can tell you that they are programming in R, they are programming in Stata, and they are quite good. I went to have meetings. Oh, wow, finally, yes, they are quite good. Okay, and at the time of the election, they are producing regularly good articles on the last surveys, how to read the last surveys, graphics also. So I think the situation gets much better than it used to be long time ago. And you have this trend in data-driven journalism, which is more and more and more important. In different parts of the world, I'm sure that in Brazil it is certainly the same. And really, I've met some of these young people. I was like a dinosaur. They were age 25 on average, and they are super good, not only in programming, but also web designing. And so I think that what is happening in that direction is certainly a good sign, certainly a very good sign. The other thing is that in most democracies, you will find a national commission which regulates the activities of the pollster. All the pollsters are members of a professional association which has a code of ethics, which is saying what is a pollster, what is a false pollster. Okay? And most of them, they are not playing with their reputation because I told you this could be having negative consequences on their clients. So this is what I could respond to you. The other thing about non-response, yes, it's a big issue, non-response. Okay, during the week of the teaching, we were talking about the academic survey, which is done in Europe, which is the European Social Survey, which is like a benchmark of survey quality on today, where they are applying completely the paradigm of the total error. They are big fans of that. The sample design that they are asking for is going to be a random sample with no replacement. So one of my colleagues did a fantastic paper, which is about xenophobia correlated with the number of contacts that you need to have to get the interview. And because there is no replacement, we can send the interviewer up to 10 times. What? The cost of that? No one can afford. Only National Research Council can afford. One interview is about $500. No one can afford that. Okay? So, but if you pay that, you can ask the interviewer going on the face-to-face place up to 10 times. And when you are correlating xenophobia with that, oh my goodness, the scaling of xenophobia of the first contact is absolutely not the same as the end of the contact list. If you continue to look for, to pursue the respondent up to 10 times, at the end, you will get what we are calling the reluctant respondent, the one that doesn't want to respond because we are the academia, we study politics, so they are suspicious on us. What is this trans people? They're going to talk to me intrusive questions. I don't want to respond. So yes, non-response is obviously a big, big, big story. The more information you have on non-response, the better to evaluate the quality of the survey. Because the question of a good survey is not making error. The problem is not the error. It is exactly like in life. The problem is not making error. The problem is to get aware of your error and not to repeat your error. It's exactly like in life in survey.
Yeah, I don't even know what to say after Bruno. But Joel, awesome, great questions. I mean, Thiago as well. Like, these are really, really good questions. The first response of what posters should do is come to the summer school, talk to you guys, and let the world take its own course, because that's fantastic. And yeah, like in terms of voting theory and using other models, economics, even there's approaches in the forecasting of trying to use qualitative data from focus groups. Like, you're getting information from that and introduce, like in a Bayesian way or so on, to input that in your model. But absolutely, I think we played a little bit with this. The hard part of last year's election was that the government is spending so much money, but really late, right? It's like the month of the election rather than, when we do GDP per capita or inflation, so on, we usually use, a few quarters, trimesters before. But it's hard because, again, we had, government who was really spending at that moment. But I think so, like I said, you should not be afraid of doing different things and seeing what you come up with. And let me think about. Yeah, so even the election of Bolsonaro in 2018, if you use other models from political science, not so much, like in polling was correct, but as opposed to so much institutions from this department here, and Glauc was part of it. But there's endogeneity when we're looking at time on TV and so on. But if you're looking at how people are feeling about democracy, feeling about the economy and so on, it would be easier to predict a populist candidate, right? So like you have from political science a bunch of theories, even in Brazil, like very focused on institutions, but they might fail. So why not run all of them and even try to incorporate or do new things? So you should definitely run those, talk to other people. Let's use them because it's information, and if we're right about voting theories, they will help. And like I said, coming to a summer school, talking about even electoral polling, because electoral polling is not so like political science, because political science is about explaining, but a lot of political science then go to polling. And I think it's important to come back to the university, talk to people, even almost invite people to do research on electoral polling, because it's something that Europeans do, it's something that Americans do, but in Brazil we do not. Like, it's very like rare, almost nothing. And again, the journalists, I think there's a good wave, and you like data journalists are doing a fantastic job. And honestly, like Bruno said, it's the combination of the association of pollsters with like a bunch of important media outlets, because it's, well, you as an economist know it's about incentives, and it's about you coordinating, because if you don't coordinate, then you're going to have different, like, from the pollsters, or, you know, sure, we're in the same association, but maybe I want to do better, and if the journalists also want to like try to compete, we actually might have bad outcomes rather than good coordination. So that's my hope, although I think we're still a few years behind France and Europe in general. And Thiago, like, for your known response, it's tough. So I worked with at the Pew Research Center in the US, and they do probability at the full stage with 8 contacts. And it's extremely expensive. I'd never seen other survey pay, I think it was around the time in Brazilian reais, $200,000 at that time. So it's insane. Like, no one will ever pay you to do a survey like that, or unless it's the European Social Survey. So it's really hard, but we have other ways to collect that data. I think the more we use telephones or tablets to conduct, we're having a better chance of at least knowing how many contacts, or like be able to collect more information on that. And the worst part is, like Bruno said, like, it's always an estimate of an estimator, which is really hard. And I think the reason why it's becoming more like important is because if we're having participation rates go down, not only election, but even just for surveys, and this is the people, the xenophobics or people from the far right, then we have even a bigger problem. So I'm not like giving you an actual response, but I'm like, I don't know, saying that I agree. I think this is a bigger response, a problem. And again, I always think of that way. It's like Bruno mentioned local elections. If that's correlated with the far right, it will be even more important in certain municipalities and certain states, right? So you got to be even more careful in certain places in general, or the topic of the study, right? So I think in general, as Bruno mentioned a few times, like what you're studying also matters, right? Like, because you could spend more money or less money and so on if you have more information prior, or if you really focus on like xenophobia, you should probably like do more contacts, right? But other things a little less. So I don't know. It's always fun. Like, this is really good questions.
Because I took notes for several questions, but I can ask you later. I don't think we can make all of them just to hear. Is there anybody else who wants to say something? Well, I think I really appreciate what you have said here. I think it was really several interesting aspects of polling, and I think it took us so much time in the previous years during the elections. I think it was very informative. I really thank you. Appreciate that you accept our invitation. And I really, I want to thank you all for being here, for waiting for this time. And just remind you that tomorrow we're going to have another online event at noon. We're going to serve lunch here because the campus is going to be closed. So we're going to all be together again for a seminar. But once more, thank you for being here. And that's it, guys. Thank you very much.